March 18, 1943. Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Lower Silesia. The wire runs in perfect geometric lines, 10 feet high, stretched between wooden posts that sink into frozen German earth. Beyond the wire, pine forests stretch toward the horizon, dark and impenetrable, a natural prison as effective as any fence. Inside the compound, men move through routines designed to fill emptiness. Some walk the perimeter, counting steps for the 1,000th time. Others huddle in barracks, playing cards with worn decks, reading books until the pages fall loose from their bindings. A few stand at the fence, hands wrapped around cold wire, staring at freedom they cannot reach. Flight Lieutenant Robert Shepard doesn't stand at the fence. He sits on his bunk in Block 104, surrounded by what others call trash. Bits of wire scavenged from food parcels. Fragments of wood from broken crates. A pencil stub worn to almost nothing. Pieces of tin from empty milk powder containers. The detritus of captivity that most men discard without thought. He turns a coil of copper wire between his fingers, studying how light catches the metal. His hands move with precision learned in another life, before the war, before the shot-down Lancaster, before the wire and the watchtowers and the endless waiting. 28 years old, prisoner since August 1942, with nothing but time and the growing conviction that silence might be more dangerous than barbed wire. The BBC broadcast continues somewhere beyond the fence. Winston Churchill speaks to Britain. Edward R. Murrow reports from London. The King addresses the Empire. Words travel through the air on invisible waves, carrying news, carrying hope, carrying the truth about a war that prisoners experience only through rumor and German propaganda. But here, inside Stalag Luft III, those words might as well not exist. The camp has no radio. The Geneva Convention permits prisoners access to information, but the Germans interpret this narrowly. They provide newspapers, German newspapers filled with reports of Reich victories and British defeats. They allow the commandant to make announcements about the war's progress, filtered through the lens of Nazi certainty. They permit letters from home, censored so thoroughly that families communicate in code, hiding real news between innocent phrases about weather and gardens. But they do not permit radios. Possession means solitary confinement or worse. The Luftwaffe guards search barracks regularly, tearing apart bunks, overturning lockers, probing walls and floors for contraband. They know prisoners want information. They know desperation grows with every month of captivity. They know that men without news lose hope, and men without hope stop causing trouble. Shepard understands this calculus. He also understands that men without news accept lies. In Block 107, Flight Lieutenant Davies believes Germany is winning because he read it in a German newspaper. In Block 109, Squadron Leader Morrison thinks the war might be over by Christmas because a guard mentioned something about peace negotiations. In the mess hall, rumors spread like infection. The Russians have collapsed, America has withdrawn, Britain is negotiating surrender. Without truth, prisoners begin to believe anything. Without facts, hope becomes indistinguishable from delusion. Without news, the camp becomes not just a prison for bodies but a prison for minds. He looks at the pieces scattered across his bunk again. Wire. What? Tin. The components of a radio receiver sit before him, disguised as garbage. He knows the theory. Before the war, he worked for Marconi Company in Chelmsford, assembling radio sets for civilian use. He understands oscillators and amplifiers, knows how crystals can detect radio waves, comprehends the physics of electromagnetic radiation converted to sound. But theory exists in laboratories with proper equipment, with manufactured components, with soldering irons and testing equipment and power supplies. Here he has wire stripped from Red Cross parcels, wood from packing crates, carbon from pencil stubs, crystals fashioned from salvaged minerals. He has no tubes, no capacitors, no proper wire, no power source beyond the camp's electrical system that guards watch carefully for unauthorized use. And he has no experience building radios from refuse. Other men have tried. In 1941, a group at Stalag Luft III attempted to construct a receiver using similar improvised methods. The Germans discovered it during a routine search. The men spent 3 weeks in solitary confinement on reduced rations. The radio, such as it was, never worked anyway. Guards displayed it afterward as a warning, a crude assembly of wire and wood that could barely be recognized as an attempt at technology. Shepard has studied that failure. The design was too ambitious, too complex, too dependent on components that didn't exist. The men tried to build what they remembered from civilian life instead of accepting the reality of their resources. They forgot that elegance matters less than function, that a simple design that works outperforms a sophisticated design that fails. He picks up a coil of copper wire, examining it in the thin light filtering through barracks windows. The wire comes from food parcels, specifically from the bindings that secure cardboard containers. Each Red Cross parcel arrives wrapped in thin copper wire, strong enough to hold packages together during transport but flexible enough to be worked by hand. Most prisoners discard this wire without thought, letting it accumulate in trash bins where German orderlies collect it for recycling. Shepard has been collecting it for 7 months. strand by strand, parcel by parcel, hiding it in various locations around the barracks, wrapped around bunk supports, tucked into seams in his mattress, coiled inside empty tins. He estimates he has perhaps 60 feet of wire now, enough for an antenna and basic coil windings if he's careful with measurements. But wire alone cannot receive broadcasts. He needs a detector, something that can convert electromagnetic waves into electrical signals. In a proper radio, this function belongs to vacuum tubes, complex devices impossible to replicate with camp resources. In crystal sets, the simplest form of radio receiver, a crystal acts as a rectifier, allowing current to flow in only one direction and thus detecting the amplitude modulation of radio waves. He reaches under his bunk, pulling out a small wooden box he carved from a piece of crate lumber. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, sits a small crystal he acquired through a transaction that cost him 3 weeks of his cigarette ration. The seller, a Polish prisoner working in the camp's electrical shop, claimed the crystal came from a German radio that failed inspection. Whether this is true doesn't matter. What matters is whether the crystal can function as a detector. In his right hand he holds a piece of wire. In his left hand the crystal. Between them the possibility of sound. He knows the theory. If he can position the wire, what radio engineers call a cat's whisker, at precisely the right point on the crystal's surface, electrons will flow in one direction only, rectifying the alternating current of a radio signal into a direct current that can drive headphones. Finding that precise point requires experimentation, patience, and luck. The crystal's surface must be neither too smooth nor too rough, must have the correct molecular structure at the point of contact, must remain stable once the right position is found. Many crystals never work at all. Others work briefly then fail. A few, if conditions align perfectly, function reliably for months. He has no way to test the crystal without constructing the rest of the radio. He has no way to construct the rest of the radio without risking discovery. He has no way to risk discovery without accepting the possibility of punishment that could make the remaining years of captivity unbearable. Yet without the radio, the remaining years of captivity will be spent in ignorance, believing whatever lies the Germans choose to tell. Outside the barracks window, snow begins to fall. Late March snow, wet and heavy, the kind that melts by afternoon but blankets everything in temporary whiteness. 2 guards walk past on patrol, their breath visible in the cold air. One laughs at something the other said. Their boots crunch through the snow in rhythm, fading as they move toward the next compound. When they pass, Shepard begins to work. His hands move quickly, wrapping wire around a piece of wood to form a coil. The mathematics of inductance occupy his thoughts. Too many turns and the coil won't resonate at the right frequency. Too few turns and it won't pick up enough signal strength. He counts carefully, keeping his motions small, ready to hide everything under his mattress at the first sound of approaching guards. Block 104 remains quiet. Most men are at the mess hall for the midday meal. Shepard volunteered to skip lunch, claiming he wasn't hungry, which earned him strange looks but no questions. Men in prison camps understand the need for privacy, for moments alone with thoughts that cannot be shared, for reasons that need no explanation. He wraps the 40-second turn of wire and stops. The coil feels right in his hands, though he has no instruments to verify his intuition. The wood beneath the wire came from a Red Cross crate, chosen for its dryness and lack of knots. The wire itself is wound as tightly as he can manage, each turn pressed against the next to maximize inductance. Now comes the crystal holder. He fashioned this earlier from a small piece of tin, bent into a shallow cup that can cradle the crystal while allowing the cat's whisker to make contact with its surface. The tin came from a condensed milk container, cut carefully with a blade he traded for 2 cigarettes. The edges are rough despite his best efforts to smooth them with a piece of sandpaper scavenged from the camp workshop. He places the crystal in its tin holder, then takes the cat's whisker, a single strand of fine copper wire, and begins the delicate process of finding the detection point. He positions the wire at various spots on the crystal's surface, pressing gently, testing the contact. Without power and without headphones he cannot know if any position works. He can only prepare the assembly so that when the full circuit is complete, the detector might function. Minutes pass. His fingers grow cold despite the barracks being warmer than outside. The concentration required makes him forget the sounds of the camp, the distant shouts from the exercise yard, the clang of metal from the kitchen, the periodic calls of guards making their rounds. His world narrows to the crystal and the wire and the invisible point where detection might occur. A door opens somewhere in the barracks. Footsteps approach. Shepard's hands move instantly, sweeping the components under his mattress in one fluid motion. He lies back on the bunk, closing his eyes, assuming the posture of sleep that prisoners adopt when they want to be left alone. The footsteps pass his bunk without stopping. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, returning from lunch early, walks to his own bunk 3 spaces down. The springs creak as Morrison sits, followed by the rustle of paper as he unwraps something saved from the meal. The smell of black bread reaches Shepard's nose, making his stomach remind him he skipped lunch. He waits 5 minutes before moving again. Morrison appears absorbed in a letter, reading it for perhaps the 100th time, carrying on a conversation with someone thousands of miles away through words that arrived months ago. Shepard retrieves his components and continues work, moving more carefully now, aware that privacy in a barracks full of men is always temporary. The radio needs an antenna. In proper civilian sets, antennas are carefully calculated based on wavelength, positioned for optimal reception, mounted on roofs or towers to catch signals from distant transmitters. In Stalag Luft III, antennas must be invisible, must blend with the camp's structures, must not attract attention from guards who know prisoners want information and watch for any sign of radio construction. He has planned for this. The barracks roof support beams run the length of the building, hidden above ceiling boards that sag slightly with age and moisture. If he can run a wire along those beams, connecting it to his receiver through a wire that drops through a crack in the ceiling boards, he will have an antenna perhaps 40 feet long, high enough to catch signals, hidden enough to avoid detection. But accessing the roof space requires accomplices. He cannot do this alone. And accomplices mean risk. Each person who knows about the radio represents another potential point of failure, another prisoner who might break under pressure, another chance that a careless word will reach the wrong ears. He has chosen carefully. Flight Lieutenant Davies, sleeping in the bunk beneath his, worked for the post office before the war installing telephone lines. He understands wire and connections and the importance of discretion. Squadron Leader Morrison, despite his belief in German propaganda, served as an aircraft electrician before receiving his commission. He knows how to work with limited tools and improvised materials. Wing Commander Thompson, the block's senior officer, once ran a clandestine newspaper at Stalag Luft III before being transferred. He understands operational security and risk management. 3 men, each with specific skills, each with reasons to want news from beyond the wire. Shepard has watched them for months, studying how they handle pressure, observing their interactions with guards, noting who keeps secrets and who gossips. These 3 he believes can be trusted. He also believes they will refuse. Building a radio from trash sounds impossible. The practical men of Block 104, the pilots and navigators and gunners who understand machines and systems, will see his pile of wire and wood and crystal and recognize it as delusion. They will tell him the Germans have sophisticated detection equipment, that guards search barracks regularly, that the punishment for radio possession is severe. They will remind him that previous attempts failed, that the odds of success are minimal, that the risk far outweighs the potential benefit. They will be right. The rational response to his plan is refusal. The sensible approach to captivity is acceptance, finding ways to endure without taking unnecessary risks, surviving until the war ends or rescue comes or some miracle provides salvation. But Shepard is not interested in the rational response. He is interested in the truth. And the truth he believes is worth the risk of failure. Outside the window the snow has stopped. The compound appears clean and white, the wire fences transformed into elegant lines against pristine background. In a few hours, boots and activity will turn the snow to slush, revealing the mud and dirt beneath. But for now, everything looks possible. Everything looks clean. He wraps his components in a piece of cloth, tying it carefully, creating a bundle that looks like nothing important. Tomorrow he will approach Davies first, explaining the plan in whispers during the morning exercise period when guards pay less attention to conversations among prisoners. If Davies agrees, they will approach Morrison together. If Morrison agrees, they will approach Thompson as a group, presenting the plan as something already half completed, momentum rather than proposal. And if they refuse, he will try anyway. Alone, with greater risk of failure, but try nonetheless. Because the alternative, accepting silence, believing lies, spending however many years remain in captivity without knowing what happens beyond the wire, that alternative is worse than any punishment the Germans can devise. March 18, 1943. Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Lower Silesia. A man sits on a bunk with pieces of wire and wood and crystal, planning to capture sound from the air, planning to hear words from London, planning to bring truth into a place built on silence and lies. The problem is not the wire or the crystal or the technical challenge of building a radio from refuse. The problem is not even the guards or the searches or the threat of punishment. The problem is that truth cannot survive in isolation. And isolation, here behind the wire, is the only thing Germany provides in abundance. The conversation happens at dawn, when the camp is coldest and guards huddle in their towers rather than patrol the compounds. Shepard finds Davies by the latrine building, a location chosen because men arriving and leaving create natural reasons for brief encounters, and because the smell discourages guards from lingering nearby. Davies listens without interrupting. Shepard explains the plan in fragments, a sentence between arrivals, another phrase when they're briefly alone, the full picture emerging in pieces over 15 minutes. When he finishes, Davies doesn't respond immediately. He lights a cigarette, a luxury saved from his Red Cross parcel, and smokes half of it before speaking. The antenna will be the problem, Davies says finally. Everything else maybe. But running wire through the roof without guards noticing during inspection, that's where this fails. Not a refusal. An engineering assessment. Shepard had prepared for resistance, for fear, for moral objections about unnecessary risk. He hadn't prepared for practical problem solving. Davies turns the question over in his mind like he's examining telephone cable, looking for weak points, testing strength. What if we don't run it through the roof? Shepard says. What if we use the existing wire? What existing wire? The bunk frames. They're metal. Connected through the floor. If we ground the receiver to the bunk frame and run a wire to the roof's metal supports, we'd have an antenna system hidden in the barracks structure itself. Davies takes another drag on his cigarette. Around them the camp begins to wake. Men emerge from barracks, heading toward the latrines, moving with the deliberate slowness of prisoners who have nowhere important to be. A guard changes position in the nearest tower, stamping his feet against the cold. That's clever, Davies says. Assuming the connections aren't too corroded. Assuming the Germans didn't ground everything when they built this place. Assuming the metal provides decent conductivity. It's copper plumbing for water, Shepard says. The supports are steel but the connecting pipes are copper. Should work. Should work isn't the same as will work. Nothing about this will work. But it might work. And might is better than definitely won't because we never tried. Davies finishes his cigarette, dropping the butt and grinding it under his boot. You'll need Morrison for the power system. Can't run this on batteries, and tapping into the camp electrical without getting caught requires someone who understands voltage regulation. I can do wire. Morrison can do power. You'll handle the receiver itself. And Thompson? Thompson needs to not know until it's too late to stop us. Davies starts walking back toward the barracks. Over his shoulder he adds, You're insane, Shepard. But I'm bored enough to be insane with you. Morrison proves easier. When they approach him 2 days later, he's in the middle of repairing a homemade chess set, carving a replacement rook from a piece of wood with a blade fashioned from a broken spoon. They wait until he finishes the piece, watching his hands work with the precision of someone who understands how small movements create larger results. Shepard shows him the schematic, a drawing on the back of a letter, lines and circles representing components and connections. Morrison studies it for perhaps 30 seconds before setting it aside. The Germans run 220-volt AC through the barracks, Morrison says. You need maybe 6 volts DC for the receiver. That's a step-down transformer you can't build and a rectifier system you don't have components for. What if we don't use the main power? Shepard asks. Then you don't have power. What if we use the light fixtures? They already step down the voltage. We tap into a light circuit, add a simple resistance-based voltage divider, maybe some improvised capacitors for smoothing. You'll burn down the barracks. Not if we're careful. Morrison picks up his wooden rook, examining it against the light, checking for imperfections. Not if we're lucky, you mean? And lucky isn't the same as careful. But yes, technically if you built a proper voltage divider and somehow created capacitors from materials that don't exist in this camp, and if you managed to not short the circuit or draw enough current to trigger the Germans' electrical monitoring equipment, then yes, technically you could power a low-current receiver from the barracks lighting system. So you're saying it's possible. I'm saying it's possible in the same way that flapping your arms really hard is technically a possible way to fly. Morrison sets down the rook and looks at both of them directly. I'm also saying I haven't had an interesting problem to solve in 18 months, and this is the most interesting problem anyone has offered me since the war started. When do we begin? Thompson is different. As Block senior officer, he carries responsibility for the men under his command. Unauthorized activities reflect on his leadership. German reprisals for rule violations fall on him first. He's older than most prisoners, 43, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that weren't there when the war began. He's been a prisoner since 1940, shot down over France, transferred through 3 camps before arriving at Stalag Luft III. They approach him on April 2nd after the evening meal, in a corner of the compound near the warning wire, the inner fence that marks the forbidden zone where guards shoot without warning. It's the one place in camp where conversations cannot be easily overheard, because no one lingers near the warning wire without good reason, and guards assume men standing there are contemplating escape rather than conspiracy. Shepard explains everything. The components he's collected, the design he's developed, Davies' solution for the antenna problem, Morrison's plan for power. Thompson listens with his hands behind his back, standing at attention by long habit, though there are no officers here to salute, no military protocol beyond what prisoners maintain to preserve their sense of identity. When Shepard finishes, Thompson asks one question. What's the goal? Sir? The goal. Are you building this to boost morale? To gather intelligence? To cause trouble? To prove it can be done? Why are you building a radio? Shepard hasn't considered this question. The need seems self-evident, to hear news, to know truth, to connect with the world beyond the wire. But Thompson is asking something deeper, something about purpose and consequence. To know what's really happening, Shepard says. The Germans tell us they're winning. Our letters from home are 6 months old and censored. We don't know if Britain is still fighting, if America is making progress, if the war will last another year or another decade. Without information we can't. He stops, looking for the right words. We can't think clearly. We start believing whatever we're told because we have no way to verify anything. A radio gives us facts. Facts let us think for ourselves. Thompson nods slowly. And when you have facts, when you know what's really happening, what then? You'll share this information? Create a news network inside the camp? Write newsletters and distribute them? That's how you turn possession of an illegal radio into a resistance operation, which turns 3 weeks in solitary into a firing squad. We'll be careful. Everyone who gets caught is careful. Right up until they're not. Thompson turns, looking across the compound at the rows of barracks, the guard towers, the wire stretching in every direction. But you're also right. We need information. We need to know we're not fighting a war that ended 6 months ago while we rot here in ignorance. And someone needs to try, even if trying is stupid and dangerous and probably doomed to fail. He turns back to face them. I won't help you build it. Can't officially. As senior officer, I can't be involved in unauthorized activities. But I also won't stop you. And I won't ask questions about why there's wire running through places wire shouldn't run, or why Morrison is suddenly very interested in the lighting fixtures, or why you three keep having whispered conversations in corners. I will, however, expect you to be extraordinarily careful, because if this fails and the Germans decide to make an example, it won't be just you three in solitary. It'll be the whole block on reduced rations while they search every inch of this compound for contraband. Understood, sir. And Shepard? When you get it working, if you get it working, the first thing you'll do is tell me what Churchill said last night. I miss hearing that stubborn bastard's voice. Construction begins in stages, spread across weeks to avoid patterns that might draw attention. Davies starts with the antenna system, working during the afternoon rest period when most prisoners nap and guards grow complacent. He traces the barracks metal support structure, identifying where steel beams connect to copper pipes, mapping a path from Shepard's bunk to the roof supports without requiring new wire runs. The existing metal framework, installed when the camp was built, forms an accidental antenna better than anything they could string up covertly. Davies discovers that the floor's metal supports connect to the roof steel beams through vertical pipes meant for drainage. By attaching the radio to the bunk frame with a wire that follows the wall's wooden boards, disguised as repair work, he creates a ground connection. By running another wire up the inside of a drainage pipe, he creates an antenna connection. The work requires tools they don't have, so Davies improvises. He fashions a screwdriver from a spoon, wrapped in cloth for grip. He creates wire strippers from 2 pieces of wood and a sharp stone. He builds a continuity tester from a battery salvaged from a guard's dropped flashlight, a small light bulb stolen from the supply room, and wire. Each tool gets hidden in a different location, under floorboards, inside mattresses, tucked into cracks in the wall. Morrison tackles the power system with the caution of someone who understands that electricity kills. He spends days studying the barracks wiring, noting which circuits carry load and which run lightly, identifying light fixtures that could support an additional draw without triggering monitoring equipment or blown fuses. He decides on the light above the barracks entrance, which operates on a separate circuit for security reasons. Guards want the entrance lit at night to watch for escape attempts, so that circuit receives priority maintenance and better voltage regulation. Morrison waits until the bulb burns out naturally, a process he accelerates by loosening it periodically so it operates in high-resistance mode, heating the filament beyond normal parameters. When the bulb fails, he volunteers to replace it. The guards, appreciating prisoners who solve problems without requiring German labor, provide him with a new bulb and 5 minutes of unsupervised access to the fixture. In those 5 minutes, Morrison installs a voltage tap so subtle that later inspections never detect it. 2 wires leading from the fixture's power supply, running along the ceiling's wooden beams where they blend with structural shadows, dropping down behind a support post that conceals their path to Shepard's bunk. The voltage divider Morrison constructs deserves documentation in engineering journals, though it will never appear in any technical manual. He creates resistors from pencil graphite, carefully measuring the carbon content by testing conductivity with his homemade meter. He fashions capacitors from layers of paper and tin foil, separated by distance measured in fractions of millimeters, assembled with patience that borders on meditation. The complete power system occupies a space smaller than a cigarette pack, hidden inside a hollowed-out book. Shepard chooses The Count of Monte Cristo for this purpose, a novel about a prisoner who escapes through intelligence and persistence, which seems appropriate. The book sits on a shelf above his bunk with a dozen other volumes, visible but unremarkable, part of the clutter that accumulates in every prisoner's living space. Shepard assembles the receiver itself over 6 days in late April. The coil he wound earlier becomes the tuning element, mounted on a board that slides along a groove Davies carved with his improvised tools. Moving the coil closer or farther from a fixed coil, made from wire wrapped around a larger piece of wood, changes the resonant frequency, allowing the receiver to tune across the shortwave bands where BBC broadcasts can be found. The crystal detector mounts in its tin holder, with the cat's whisker positioned through a hole drilled using a nail heated red-hot in a candle flame. The positioning mechanism allows minute adjustments through a screw salvaged from a broken bed frame. Finding the detection point requires patience and luck in equal measure. Shepard spends 3 hours touching the wire to different spots on the crystal's surface before finding a position where current flows. But the receiver needs more than detection. It needs amplification. Sound waves in the air create such minute electrical currents that hearing them requires either perfect silence or a way to increase their strength. Shepard doesn't have vacuum tubes. He doesn't have transistors, which exist only in research laboratories in 1943. He doesn't have any of the components a real engineer would consider necessary for amplification. He has a carbon microphone element. This piece, acquired through a transaction that cost him a week's worth of cigarettes and a spare pair of socks, came from a German field telephone damaged during a training exercise. The Polish prisoner who sold it claimed to have no idea what it was for, only that English prisoners sometimes bought German electrical parts. Whether this story is true doesn't matter. What matters is that carbon microphone elements can amplify signals if configured properly. The principle is simple. Sound waves compress carbon granules, changing their resistance. Connect a power source and the resistance changes translate to current changes, creating an amplified version of the original signal. It's how early telephone systems worked, how radio microphones functioned before better technologies emerged. It's crude, inefficient, and temperamental. It's also the only amplification method available using materials in Stalag Luft III. Shepard mounts the carbon element in a circuit between the crystal detector and the headphones, fashioned from telephone receiver elements Morrison acquired through means he refuses to explain. The power comes from Morrison's voltage divider, stepped down to the low voltage the carbon element requires. The complete circuit occupies a wooden box roughly the size of 2 packs of cigarettes, with connections running through small holes to the antenna and ground wires. The entire assembly can be disassembled in under 10 seconds, reducing to a collection of parts that individually appear to be nothing but trash. The coils become wound wire on scrap wood. The crystal detector becomes a small stone in a piece of tin. The carbon element returns to its hiding place. The headphones separate into pieces stored in 3 different locations. During searches, guards see only a prisoner's collection of minor repairs and salvaged materials, the normal accumulation of captivity's small industries. On the night of April 27, 1943, Shepard assembles the complete radio for the first time since beginning construction. The barracks is quiet, with most men asleep or reading by dim light. Morrison and Davies sit nearby, apparently playing chess, actually providing cover and watching for guards. Thompson lies on his bunk pretending to read, positioned where he can see the doorway and provide warning if anyone approaches. Shepard connects the ground wire to the bunk frame. He runs the antenna wire up along the wall to where Davies installed the connection to the drainage pipe. He attaches the power leads to Morrison's voltage divider. He positions the headphones, pieces of broken telephone receivers wired together with scavenged copper, near his ears without actually putting them on yet, knowing that until he verifies the circuit works, they might damage his hearing if something is wrong with the voltage levels. He touches the headphone to one ear. Static. Loud static, harsh and crackling, the sound of electromagnetic noise filling the shortwave bands. He adjusts the tuning coil, moving it fractionally along its track, listening as the static changes pitch and character. Higher frequencies produce sharper noise. Lower frequencies create a rumble like distant thunder. He tunes slowly across the band where BBC broadcasts should appear, moving the coil millimeter by millimeter, knowing that shortwave signals are narrow and easily missed. Static continues. Then briefly what might be a carrier wave, a steady tone suggesting an active transmitter. He fine-tunes carefully, adjusting the cat's whisker position on the crystal, trying to find the exact configuration where detection improves. A voice emerges from the static. Faint, distorted, barely comprehensible but definitely a voice. Speaking English. Speaking with a British accent. Speaking about, the words fade before he can understand them. He adjusts again. The voice returns, clearer now, reports from the Ministry of Information indicate. Shepard's hands shake. He steadies them, maintaining the crystal position, afraid that any movement will lose the signal. The voice continues, production figures for April exceed targets established in the previous quarter, with particular increases in aircraft manufacturing. The signal fades again. He adjusts, finding it, losing it, finding it. Each time the voice appears, it carries fragments of information from beyond the wire. Production figures. Ministry reports. April 1943. The news is current, recent, real. The BBC is broadcasting. Britain is still fighting. The war continues and the radio works. He listens for 20 minutes, catching perhaps every third word clearly, filling in the rest from context and guess. The broadcast discusses industrial production, military operations in North Africa, political developments in Parliament. Ordinary news that sounds extraordinary to a man who hasn't heard unfiltered information in 9 months. When the broadcast ends, Or when he loses the signal permanently, he can't tell which. Shepard removes the headphones. His hands continue shaking. He looks at Morrison and Davies, both watching him with expressions carefully controlled to show nothing, maintaining the appearance of chess players even though neither has touched a piece in 20 minutes. It works, Shepard whispers. Davies moves a bishop. Morrison studies the board. Thompson turns a page in his book. Around them, the barracks continues its evening routine, men reading or talking or preparing for sleep, unaware that words from London have just traveled through the air and wire and crystal to arrive in this small corner of German-occupied Poland. The transformation is complete. They are no longer men isolated from the world, dependent on German propaganda and censored letters for information. They are connected. They can hear. They know. Now comes the question of what to do with knowing. The morning after the first successful reception, Wing Commander Thompson calls an informal meeting in the far corner of the compound during exercise period. 15 men arrive, scattered to appear casual, standing in groups of 2 or 3, close enough to hear but far enough apart to avoid the appearance of conspiracy. Thompson speaks quietly, his words carrying just far enough for the gathered prisoners to hear. Information has reached us through reliable means regarding current events beyond the camp. This information will be shared discreetly on a need-to-know basis. There will be no discussion of sources. There will be no written records. There will be no distribution beyond those present here. Anyone who cannot maintain operational security should leave now. No one leaves. The BBC broadcast on April 27 reported the following. Allied forces continue to advance in Tunisia. German and Italian positions near Tunis are under sustained pressure. Production figures for British aircraft exceed German estimates by significant margins. Soviet forces maintain pressure on the Eastern Front despite German counteroffensives. These facts contradict German reports that the Afrika Korps is winning in Tunisia and that British production is collapsing. The men absorb this in silence. Some nod slightly. Others maintain carefully neutral expressions. All understand the implications. The war Germany claims to be winning appears to be going differently than camp propaganda suggests. Additional broadcasts will be monitored as possible, Thompson continues. Information will be shared during exercise periods using this format. Questions will not be asked about technical details. Cooperation with this operation constitutes acceptance of personal risk. Dismissed. The group disperses gradually, men drifting back to other activities, maintaining the appearance of having gathered by coincidence rather than intention. Shepard watches from near the warning wire, maintaining distance from the group, avoiding any connection between himself and the information Thompson shared. The security protocols are strict and necessary. The fewer people who know about the radio's existence, the less chance of discovery. The men who receive information don't know how it's obtained. They don't know who obtains it. They know only that Wing Commander Thompson, a man they trust, provides news that seems reliable and contradicts German claims. This structure protects everyone. If someone breaks under interrogation, they can reveal only that Thompson shares news, not where the news comes from. If guards discover the information network, they find only a verbal distribution system with no physical evidence. The radio itself remains hidden, known to only 4 people, separated by layers of operational security from the men who benefit from its intelligence. Over the following weeks, a routine develops. Shepard listens to BBC broadcasts twice weekly, during evening hours when the camp is least active and guards are most complacent. He memorizes key points rather than writing anything down. The next morning he shares these points with Thompson during their daily consultation about block administration, a meeting that occurs regularly enough to avoid suspicion. Thompson translates the raw information into intelligence suitable for distribution. He removes specific details that might reveal the source. He contextualizes facts within the prisoner's understanding of the war. He presents information in casual conversation during exercise periods, making it seem like informed speculation rather than confirmed intelligence. The effect on camp morale is immediate and substantial. Men who believe German claims of imminent victory suddenly understand that the war continues, that Allied forces make progress, that hope remains justified. The psychological impact of reliable information cannot be overstated. Prisoners who were sinking into resignation find reasons to maintain discipline, to plan for eventual liberation, to believe that captivity is temporary rather than permanent. But information creates complications as well as benefits. Some men refuse to believe good news, having conditioned themselves to expect only bad outcomes. Others become reckless with confidence, discussing Allied advances too openly, drawing guard attention. Still others demand more details, wanting to know how Thompson acquires his intelligence, pressing for information that could compromise security. Thompson handles these challenges with the skill of a man who understands human nature. He provides enough information to maintain morale without creating overconfidence. He shares setbacks alongside advances, maintaining credibility by presenting balanced assessments rather than propaganda. He shuts down conversations that become too detailed or too loud, reminding men that loose talk creates risk for everyone. The German guards notice something has changed. Prisoners seem more confident, more resilient, less affected by German announcements of victories. The camp commandant, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindiner-Wilda, mentions this in his May report to Berlin. Prisoner morale remains surprisingly high despite reports of German advances. Source of their confidence is unclear. Possibility of unauthorized news reception is being investigated. The investigation begins with increased inspections. Guards search barracks more frequently, looking for hidden radios, examining wire runs, checking for unauthorized connections to the camp's electrical system. They bring detection equipment, simple radio receivers tuned to local frequencies, used to identify transmissions from prisoner-built radios. But Shepard's radio doesn't transmit. It only receives. Detection equipment designed to find transmitters cannot locate a receiver that emits no signal. The guards search Block 1043 times in June without finding anything. They examine the metal frameworks Davies used as an antenna, not realizing that the structural elements serve a dual purpose. They test the electrical system Morrison tapped, finding nothing unusual about voltage or current draw. The radio remains hidden in plain sight, its components distributed and disguised as normal prisoner possessions. In July, the BBC reports the Allied invasion of Sicily. This news is significant. A major operation, a clear indication that Allied forces are taking offensive action, not merely defending against German advances. When Thompson shares this information during the morning exercise period, the response is electric. Men who had doubted now believe. Men who had resigned themselves to years of captivity suddenly see the possibility of liberation within months. But the news also creates a problem. The invasion of Sicily is significant enough that German propaganda cannot ignore it entirely. Within 2 days, the camp commandant announces that German and Italian forces are repositioning in the Mediterranean theater. The German newspaper available in camp reports strategic adjustments to counter limited Allied incursions. The prisoners now possess two conflicting accounts of the same events. German sources describe a controlled repositioning, a tactical adjustment that maintains Axis control of the Mediterranean. The BBC describes a major invasion, Allied forces storming beaches and overwhelming Italian defenders, German units in retreat. For the first time, the value of the radio becomes visible to men beyond Thompson's inner circle. Prisoners begin openly discussing the contradiction between German reports and rumors of Allied success. They start questioning German announcements more critically, analyzing propaganda techniques, recognizing patterns of distortion. The guards notice this too. The July 15th Guard report notes, prisoners display unusual confidence regarding Sicily operations. Multiple prisoners have made comments suggesting knowledge of events beyond official announcements. Source remains unidentified. The Gestapo becomes involved in August. 2 officers arrive from Berlin, specialists in counterintelligence, tasked with identifying how prisoners receive unauthorized information. They interview prisoners individually, asking seemingly casual questions about their sources of news, their basis for optimism, their understanding of military operations. Shepard endures his interview with the outward calm of someone who has nothing to hide and the internal terror of someone who has everything to hide. The Gestapo officer, a man named Hartmann who speaks perfect English with a slight American accent, sits across from him in the commandant's office and smiles pleasantly. "You are educated, I see from your records," Hartmann says, consulting a file. "Engineering background. Worked for Marconi before the war. Interesting company, Marconi. They make radios, yes?" "They make communications equipment," Shepard replies. "Indeed. Communications equipment. Radios, telephones, transmitters. You would know how to build such things, I imagine. With proper materials." "With proper materials, yes. And without proper materials? Could a skilled engineer improvise? Use salvaged parts, perhaps scavenged from parcels or stolen from camp supplies?" "I wouldn't know. I've never tried." Hartmann leans back in his chair. The prisoners in this camp display remarkable knowledge of current events. They know things that should be unknown to men cut off from news sources. This knowledge comes from somewhere. Do you know where? People talk. Rumors spread. Someone hears something from a guard, passes it along, embellishes it. By the time it reaches everyone, fiction and fact are indistinguishable. Yes, rumors. But these rumors prove accurate when verified against actual events. That suggests a reliable source, not mere speculation. Or it suggests lucky guesses that people remember while forgetting the wrong guesses. The interview continues for 40 minutes, Hartmann probing politely but persistently, searching for inconsistencies or nervous reactions. Shepard provides nothing useful. When the interview concludes, Hartmann closes his file and stands. "You should be careful, Flight Lieutenant Shepard. Clever men sometimes become too clever for their own safety. This camp is comfortable as prisoner accommodations go. Solitary confinement in the cooler is considerably less comfortable. Remember that before engaging in activities that might displease the camp administration. The warning is clear. The Gestapo suspects him, though they lack evidence. He is being watched. For 2 weeks after the Gestapo visit, Shepard does not operate the radio. He disassembles it completely, hiding components in 6 different locations, creating separation that would make reassembly difficult to prove even if all pieces were discovered. He maintains his normal routine, drawing no attention, giving Hartmann no reason to continue suspecting him. But the absence of news creates its own problem. Men who had grown accustomed to reliable information from Thompson suddenly receive nothing. Morale begins declining again. Rumors spread, Thompson's source was discovered, everyone involved was punished, the intelligence was false all along. The confidence built over 3 months starts eroding. On August 30th, Thompson approaches Shepard during exercise period. They walk together near the warning wire, maintaining casual posture, 2 men taking exercise, nothing more. The men need information, Thompson says quietly. Morale is collapsing faster than it built up. Human psychology works that way, hope withdrawn hurts worse than hope never offered. The Gestapo is watching me. The Gestapo is watching everyone. That's what they do. But they're also stretched thin. 2 officers for a camp of 10,000 prisoners across multiple compounds. They can't sustain intensive surveillance indefinitely. If you remain unremarkable long enough, they'll shift attention elsewhere. And if they catch us? Then we stop being unremarkable and start being examples. But that's true whether we continue or stop. They suspect something exists. Stopping doesn't eliminate suspicion, it just means we gain nothing from taking the risk we're already taking by being suspects. Shepard considers this logic. Thompson is right. The Gestapo's suspicion exists independent of current operations. Stopping the radio doesn't eliminate risk. It only eliminates benefit. 1 broadcast per week, Shepard says. Minimal time powered up. Short sessions, no longer than necessary to confirm key information. And if anything feels wrong, any unusual guard activity, any change in search patterns, we stop immediately. Agreed. The broadcasts resume in September, more carefully now with additional security protocols. Shepard operates the radio only during guard shift changes, when attention is divided. He reduces listening time from 20 minutes to 10, capturing only the most critical information. He varies the days of operation, avoiding patterns that might allow the Germans to correlate broadcast times with prisoner behavior. The intelligence gathered during these brief sessions proves increasingly significant. On September 3rd, he hears confirmation of Italy's surrender. On September 9th, news of Allied landings at Salerno. In October, reports of continued Soviet advances in the east. In November, the Tehran conference where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meet to coordinate strategy. Each piece of information, shared carefully through Thompson's distribution network, reinforces the understanding that Germany is not winning the war it claims to be winning. The prisoners remain trapped behind wire, but they know that the wire is temporary, that forces beyond their control are working toward their liberation, that endurance matters because liberation is coming. But knowledge comes with weight. The men who know about the radio carry the burden of its secrecy. Davies, whose antenna work makes the receptions possible, cannot tell anyone about his contribution. Morrison, whose power system enables the operation, receives no recognition for his technical achievement. Shepard, who conceived and built the device, remains anonymous to everyone except the 3 men who help him. They cannot share their success. They cannot document their achievement. They cannot even acknowledge to each other in most circumstances that the work continues. The radio exists in the space between secrecy and utility, valuable only insofar as it remains undiscovered, meaningful only because it operates in shadow. In December, a search of Block 104 comes closer to success than any previous attempt. Guards discover Davies's makeshift tools hidden under a floorboard. They find Morrison's voltage testing equipment concealed in a mattress. They locate wire coils that Shepard intended for spare parts, wrapped in cloth and tucked behind a ceiling beam. The guards confiscate everything. They question all 3 men separately, asking about the purpose of the tools, the reason for collected wire, the explanation for hidden materials. Davies claims he was planning to repair bunks that were becoming unstable. The tools were for woodworking. Morrison says he was studying electrical systems out of professional interest. The testing equipment was for learning, not for use. Shepard explains that he collects wire for potential crafts projects. Many prisoners make small items to trade for cigarettes. None of these explanations is entirely believable. But none is entirely disprovable either. The guards cannot prove the items were used to build anything unauthorized. They issue warnings, confiscate the materials, increase surveillance. But they do not punish anyone. The radio itself, disassembled and hidden separately, remains undiscovered. That night, after the guards complete their search, Shepard lies on his bunk staring at the ceiling. The crystal detector is wrapped in cloth, buried in the compound's far corner under 6 inches of dirt. The headphones are separated into components stored by 3 different prisoners who don't know what they're storing. The coils exist only as wire that needs to be rewound. The power system Morrison built with such care is gone, confiscated by guards who probably threw it away as prisoner junk. Rebuilding will take weeks. The risk has increased substantially. The guards are actively looking for radio components now, not just generally searching for contraband. Each piece reconstructed creates new exposure, new chances of discovery. But the alternative is returning to ignorance. It's accepting whatever Germany chooses to tell them. It's surrendering the one advantage they've gained in 18 months of captivity, the ability to know truth. On December 20th, Shepard begins collecting wire again. The transformation is permanent. Once you've heard words from London, silence becomes intolerable. January 1945. The Russians are coming. Everyone in Stalag Luft III knows this, though the knowledge comes from different sources with different levels of accuracy. German guards speak nervously among themselves, their conversations overheard by prisoners who have learned to read anxiety in posture and tone. The BBC broadcasts, received now on a rebuilt radio that has survived 2 years of operation through careful maintenance and extraordinary luck, report Soviet advances through Poland. Even the German newspapers, typically filled with propaganda, cannot hide the reality that the Eastern Front is collapsing. The camp commandant, von Lindner, having been replaced by Oberst Braun after the March 1944 escape attempt, issues orders on January 27. All prisoners are to prepare for evacuation. The Luftwaffe command has decided to move prisoners west, away from advancing Soviet forces, toward camps deeper in German-controlled territory. The evacuation will begin at midnight. Shepard stands in Block 104 with the radio assembled one final time, listening to the BBC report Soviet forces approaching Sagan. The broadcast is clear tonight, clearer than usual, perhaps because German military transmitters have been relocated and no longer create interference. The announcer's voice remains calm despite describing events that sound apocalyptic. Millions of soldiers moving westward, entire armies in motion. The largest military operation in human history sweeping across Poland toward Germany proper. He removes the headphones and looks at the device that has occupied so much of his life for 22 months. The crystal detector, miraculously still functional despite 2 years of use. The coils, rewound 3 times after confiscations. The power system, rebuilt from new materials after the December 1943 search. The antenna connections, maintained through constant vigilance and repair. Morrison enters the barracks carrying his packed kit. Are you bringing it? Shepard considers this question. The radio weighs perhaps 3 pounds. It disassembles into components small enough to distribute among the 3 of them. In theory, it could be transported during the evacuation march, hidden among personal possessions, reassembled when they reach the next camp. But the march will involve close supervision, possible searches, unpredictable conditions. Carrying radio components during evacuation means risking discovery when guards are most nervous, most likely to respond harshly to rule violations. It means potentially compromising not just themselves but all the men they've worked to keep informed. No, Shepard says. We're not bringing it. He disassembles the radio methodically, separating components, preparing to hide them in the barracks for whoever might find them later. Perhaps other prisoners if the Germans reopen the camp, perhaps Russian soldiers when they arrive, perhaps no one, left to decay in an abandoned building that served briefly as a prison and then returned to meaninglessness. But as he works, Davies appears at the doorway. Thompson wants to speak with you. Both of you. In his office. Thompson's office is a corner of the barracks partitioned with hanging blankets for minimal privacy. Inside, Thompson sits on his bunk with 15 men crowded into the small space, standing because there is no room to sit. These are the men who received information from the radio, who benefited from knowing truth when surrounded by lies, who maintained morale through 2 years of captivity because they understood that Germany was losing the war it claimed to be winning. They want to thank him. They want to acknowledge what he did. And they cannot, because even now, with the camp about to be evacuated and the Germans distracted by the approaching Russians, operational security matters. Some of these men might not survive the march. Others might be separated, sent to different camps, fall into different hands. What they know about the radio's existence remains a vulnerability. Thompson understands this. Instead of allowing acknowledgments, he speaks briefly. We're about to walk into winter with inadequate clothing, insufficient food, and uncertain destination. Many of us will not survive. Those who do will survive because we maintain discipline, because we had morale, because we had hope. Hope requires believing in something beyond current circumstances. For 2 years, some of you provided that belief. That contribution will not be forgotten, though it cannot be discussed. Dismissed. The men file out silently. Some nod to Shepard as they pass. Others avoid eye contact, maintaining the fiction that they don't know what they're acknowledging. When the last man leaves, only Shepard, Morrison, Davies, and Thompson remain. The radio needs to be destroyed, Thompson says. Not hidden. Destroyed. If the Russians find it, they'll want to know who built it and why. If the Germans find it after we leave, they'll investigate who was here, possibly retaliate against prisoners in other camps. It needs to stop existing. Shepard nods. He expected this. he also dreads it. They carry the components outside to the compound's latrine pit, a structure that will be one of the last things burned when the Germans abandon the camp. Morrison brings tools scavenged from the workshop. Davies arrives with a hammer fashioned from scrap metal. Together they systematically destroy every piece. The crystal gets smashed into powder. The coils get unwound, the wire cut into pieces too short to be useful. The power components get dismantled and scattered. The antenna connections get severed and removed. Within 20 minutes, no evidence remains that the radio ever existed. But evidence of its impact remains in the men preparing to march into winter darkness, sustained by the knowledge that Germany is losing, that liberation approaches, that endurance matters. That evidence will walk out of Stalag Luft III on foot, carried not in components or wires but in resilience built from information, in hope maintained through truth. The evacuation march begins at midnight on January 28, 1945. 10,000 prisoners leave the camp in a column that stretches for miles, guarded by Luftwaffe soldiers who are themselves retreating from the Eastern Front. The temperature is -20°C. Snow falls steadily. Men carry what they can: blankets, food saved from parcels, personal possessions. They leave behind barracks and wire and everything that made Stalag Luft III their home for years of captivity. Shepard walks with his hands in his pockets, collar raised against the cold, thinking about the radio that no longer exists. He wonders if it mattered. If the information they provided actually changed anything. If knowing that Germany was losing helped men survive, or if survival came from other sources, from determination, from luck, from factors entirely independent of anything he did. The march continues through the night, through the following day, through days that blend together into a continuous experience of cold and exhaustion and survival. Men collapse by the roadside. Guards sometimes allow prisoners to help those who fall, sometimes order the column to keep moving. The weak separate from the strong. The lucky separate from the unlucky. On February 3rd, they reach Spremberg and are loaded onto trains. The train journey to Nuremberg takes 3 days in boxcars designed for freight, not passengers. Men crowd together for warmth, sharing the body heat that keeps some alive while others freeze. The train stops occasionally at stations where German civilians watch prisoners pass with expressions Shepard cannot read: pity, perhaps, or satisfaction, or simple exhaustion with a war that has consumed everything. At Nuremberg they are distributed among several camps. Shepard, Morrison and Davies end up at Stalag 13D, a facility less organized than Stalag Luft III, more crowded, with fewer amenities. The Geneva Convention provisions that govern Luftwaffe camps appear not to apply here, or perhaps the Germans no longer have resources to maintain standards with the war collapsing around them. But they have news. Real news, not from a hidden radio but from guards who speak openly about German defeats, from German newspapers that can no longer disguise the reality of Soviet armies approaching from the east and American armies approaching from the west, from the sound of Allied bombers flying overhead with such frequency that air raid sirens become background noise. In April 1945, American forces approach Nuremberg. The guards abandon the camp on April 15, leaving prisoners without food or supervision. For 2 days, chaos reigns. Some prisoners try to escape, others wait for liberation, everyone scrambles for anything edible or useful from the departing Germans' abandoned supplies. American troops arrive on April 17. They find 10,000 prisoners, many sick, all malnourished, standing at the gates of a camp with no guards, no German authority, no structure beyond what the prisoners maintain themselves. The Americans bring food, medical care, transportation plans. They also bring photographers and journalists who document everything for records and newspapers. In one photograph, taken by an Army Signal Corps photographer on April 18, 1945, Flight Lieutenant Robert Shepard stands with a group of prisoners behind the liberated gates of Stalag 13D. He looks thin, older than his 30 years, wearing a jacket that no longer fits properly because he lost so much weight during the evacuation march. His expression is neutral, carefully controlled, the face of a man who has practiced showing nothing for so long that genuine emotion requires conscious effort. The photograph includes no caption identifying him. No record mentions what he did in Stalag Luft III. No documentation exists of the radio he built from trash or the intelligence it provided or the impact on morale it created. The photograph shows simply, one prisoner among thousands, unremarkable, anonymous, waiting for transport to somewhere that is not a prison camp. Shepard returns to England in May 1945, processed through repatriation centers that handle thousands of returning prisoners of war. He receives medical evaluation, psychological assessment, debriefing by military intelligence officers who ask detailed questions about camp conditions, guard behavior, German military capabilities observed during captivity. No one asks about radios. No one asks about information networks. No one asks how prisoners knew things they shouldn't have known or maintained morale they shouldn't have maintained. The questions focus on official concerns: treatment according to Geneva Convention, evidence of war crimes, intelligence about German capabilities. He answers truthfully and incompletely, providing facts without context, descriptions without explanation. When the debriefing officers finish, they classify him as fit for release and direct him to report to a demobilization center for processing out of service. He returns to civilian life in June 1945. Returns to his parents' house in Chelmsford, sleeping in a bed that feels too soft, eating at a table that seems obscenely laden with food, adjusting to a world where doors have no locks because no one locks prisoners in. His mother asks what happened in the camps. He tells her it was bearable, and changes the subject. Marconi Company offers him his old position back. The company has grown during the war, expanded into military communications, developed new technologies. They need engineers with radio experience. He accepts and returns to work assembling radio receivers in a factory where proper components and testing equipment and everything he lacked in Stalag Luft III exists in abundance. He never tells anyone at Marconi about the radio he built from trash. Never mentions it to colleagues or friends or family. Never writes about it in memoirs or interviews. When pressed about his wartime experience, he provides the acceptable summary: shot down over France. Prisoner for 3 years. Lucky to survive. This is true. It is also incomplete. In 1953, 8 years after the war's end, Shepard receives a letter forwarded through RAF channels. The letter comes from Group Captain Thompson, retired from service, living in Sussex, writing to former prisoners with whom he shared captivity. Thompson writes about ordinary things: his garden, his grandchildren, his adjustment to civilian life. Then, in a paragraph that could be easily missed, he writes, "I sometimes think about the winter of '43, and how we managed to maintain hope when circumstances suggested hope was irrational. Intelligence suggests that prisoners who believed liberation was possible survived at higher rates than those who gave up. Believing correctly, it seems, provides survival advantage over believing incorrectly or not believing at all. One might say that access to accurate information quite literally saved lives, though such things are difficult to prove statistically." Shepard reads this paragraph multiple times. Thompson is acknowledging, in language carefully chosen to reveal nothing to anyone who doesn't already know, that the radio mattered. That the information it provided contributed to survival in measurable ways. But Thompson is also acknowledging something else: that proof is impossible. The men who survived cannot be separated cleanly from the men who would have survived anyway. The impact of information cannot be isolated from the impact of personality, luck, physical health, and hundreds of other variables. The radio helped. How much it helped and whether that help justified the risk remains unknowable. Shepard writes back, "I sometimes think about the same period. Difficult times produce difficult decisions. Looking back, one wonders if different choices would have produced better or worse outcomes. But we made the choices we made with the information we had, and we survived. Perhaps that is sufficient." Thompson replies, "It is sufficient." They exchange letters for several years, discussing gardening and retirement and grandchildren, never again mentioning radios or information or the winter of 1943. Thompson dies in 1961. Shepard attends the funeral, standing among 24 former prisoners who gather to honor a man they respected. Several mention Thompson's leadership during captivity. None mention the intelligence network he ran or the sources he protected. In 1968, Shepard retires from Marconi Company after 23 years of civilian service. He receives a modest pension and a small ceremony where colleagues present him with an engraved radio, a tabletop model with polished wood casing and proper vacuum tubes and all the components a real radio should have. The inscription reads, "To Robert Shepard for decades of dedicated service." He keeps the radio on a shelf in his study. Sometimes, late at night when he cannot sleep, he turns it on and listens to BBC broadcast. The technology is vastly better now. Transistors have replaced tubes, frequency modulation provides clarity that amplitude modulation never achieved, miniaturization has reduced radios to sizes that would have seemed impossible in 1943. But the purpose remains unchanged. Words travel through air on electromagnetic waves, carrying information from one place to another, connecting people separated by distance or circumstance. The principle is the same whether the radio is built in a factory with proper components or assembled in a prison camp from wire and crystal in desperation. In 1982, a researcher working on a history of Stalag Luft III contacts Shepard. The researcher has found references in German records to suspected information networks in the camp, mentions of Gestapo investigations, notes about prisoners displaying unusual knowledge of military events. The researcher asks if Shepard knows anything about this. "Rumors spread in camps," Shepard replies. "People heard things from guards, made guesses, shared information. Nothing organized that I knew about." This is technically true. The radio was not a network. The radio was a single device operated by one person, with intelligence distributed through a separate network that had no physical connection to the device itself. Shepard knew about the radio because he built it. He did not know, technically, about the information distribution network because Thompson ran that independently. The researcher accepts this answer and moves on to other questions about camp conditions, guard behavior, administrative structure. The questions never return to information networks. The book, when published in 1984, mentions in a single footnote that prisoners at Stalag Luft III may have had access to unauthorized news sources, though details remain unclear. Shepard reads this footnote with grim satisfaction. Details remain unclear because the people who knew the details chose to keep them unclear. Security habits developed in captivity persist decades after the circumstances that created them have ended. He dies in 1989 at age 74 in a hospital in Chelmsford. His obituary in the local newspaper mentions his work at Marconi Company, his service in RAF Bomber Command, his survival as a prisoner of war. It does not mention radios built from trash information networks in German camps, or crystal detectors fashioned from salvaged materials. His personal effects are handled by his daughter, who finds in his study a collection of items that seem unrelated. A small crystal wrapped in cloth, a coil of copper wire, a piece of tin shaped like a small cup, fragments of wood with grooves carved at precise intervals. She asks her mother what these items are. Her mother says, "Things from the war. Your father kept them for reasons I never understood. You can throw them away if you like." She keeps them instead, placing them in a box with other wartime memorabilia, medals, photographs, letters. The items sit in storage for years, their significance unknown, their purpose forgotten, physical evidence of something that cannot be understood without context that no longer exists. In 2003, a museum in London organizes an exhibition on prisoner of war experiences. The museum contacts families of former POWs, requesting artifacts for display. Shepard's daughter donates several items, including the box of wartime memorabilia. A curator examining the contents finds the crystal, the wire, the tin cup, the carved wood. The curator is not an engineer. She does not recognize these items as radio components. She catalogs them as unidentified prison camp artifacts, and places them in storage, where they remain, preserved but unexplained, evidence without understanding. But the radio's legacy does not exist in components. It exists in survival. Shepard survived. Morrison survived. Davies survived. Thompson survived. Of the 15 men who knew they were receiving information from an unauthorized source, 13 survived the evacuation march and eventual liberation. The survival rate was 87%. The overall survival rate for prisoners who evacuated from Stalag Luft III was 72%. This 15% difference cannot be attributed solely to information access. Other factors contributed: physical health, luck, assistance from fellow prisoners. But information provided something measurable: reason to continue during the march when stopping meant death, belief that the suffering was temporary when permanent seemed more likely, hope that liberation approached when despair seemed rational. Hope, it turns out, has survival value. And hope requires believing in something beyond current circumstances. For 2 years in Stalag Luft III, a radio built from trash provided that belief. Provided facts when surrounded by lies. Provided truth when Germany offered only propaganda. The radio is gone. The men who built it are dead. The camps are demolished or converted to museums. The wire and crystal and improvised components have returned to materials, their brief service as a receiver forgotten or unknown. But on February 3, 1945, when prisoners marched from Stalag Luft III into winter darkness, those who walked knew that Germany was losing. Knew that Soviet and American forces approached. Knew that endurance mattered because liberation approached. They knew these things not from hope or faith or delusion, but from facts received on a radio built from refuse by a man who understood that truth, even difficult truth, provides better foundation for survival than comforting lies. And they survived. That is the legacy. Not the device but what the device enabled. Not the components but what the components created. Not the radio but the truth the radio carried. March 18, 1943. Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Lower Silesia. A man sits on a bunk with pieces of wire and wood and crystal, planning to capture sound from the air, planning to hear words from London, planning to bring truth into a place built on silence and lies. April 17, 1945. Stalag 13D, Nuremberg, Germany. American troops liberate 10,000 prisoners, including a man who built a radio from trash and never told anyone, because operational security matters more than credit, because survival matters more than recognition, because sometimes the most important things are the ones that must remain unspoken. The wire is silent now. But the words it carried still echo, preserved not in archives or museums or official histories, but in the lives of men who survived because they knew. Because someone built a radio from refuse. Because truth matters even, especially, when surrounded by lies. And because sometimes, the trash others discard contains everything necessary to stay human.